Hello and welcome along to the industry analysis for the management case study of August 2019. Here we're going to be focusing on the real-world cruise ship industry, and a very interesting industry it is indeed. So before we get into the actual meat of the industry analysis, I just want to address one question which is often raised by CIMA students, and that is, what is the purpose or the point of the industry analysis? After all, we are presented with some relevant industry information in the pre-seen document itself. So is it not surplus to requirements to do a separate industry analysis? I think the answer to that is no, it is not surplus to requirements. However, I must acknowledge, of course, that you are not expected to be an industry expert by any stretch of the imagination. Of course, you're not expected to know every single detail of the wider industry. However, nevertheless, there are some really good reasons why it is a good idea to do a wider, broader industry analysis than what you're presented with simply in the pre-seen document itself. Understanding the wider business environment and industrial context has two key potential benefits on exam day. Firstly, it helps you to anticipate some of the potential issues or scenarios that might arise in the unseen on the exam day itself, and therefore avoid surprises or confusion. So if you think about it, if you're presented with a scenario that has some, for example, unusual terminology or specific examples that come from the broader industry, you're much more likely to be able to quickly process that information and understand it if you already have some familiarity with the wider industry. Now, of course, it's not always going to be the case that the unseen scenario is going to use unusual terminology or very industry-specific terminology. However, it might use concepts that are very common in the industry. It might use references to certain kinds of features of the industry that you will be more familiar with if you do this broader industry analysis. It also helps you to imagine some kinds of scenarios that might arise given your knowledge of the wider business context. A second important reason, I think, to do an industry analysis is that it makes it easier on exam day to illustrate and apply your abstract theoretical knowledge by using concrete examples and specifics from the business and industry context. It is not enough, of course, to simply abstractly state your various theories and principles from your objective test studies. You will actually need to show that you can apply it to realistic scenarios. And of course, it's better if you understand the real world industry in that case, because of course then your ability to apply to realistic scenarios will be much sharper. So for those two reasons, I think it's important to give the industry a little bit more time than simply is given to it in the pre-seen document itself. And so that's what we've done here in this industry analysis. Now, of course, in some cases, some tuition providers might go into a bit of overkill with the industry analysis. They might supply you with hundreds of pages of information on the industry, and we believe that that is not necessary. What we have done instead is we have already analysed the industry for you, and we've distilled it down into its essential parts and components, particularly those most relevant to the pre-seen document. So before we get into the industry analysis, let's just have a quick rundown of what exactly we're going to be going through. In the first section, we're going to perform a quantitative analysis. We're going to be focusing on some of the key figures and numbers from the industry, both in terms of past trends and indeed projections for the coming years. From there, then, we're moving into a more qualitative dimension, I should say. We're looking at customer analysis and demand analysis, some of the influences on demand, some of the factors that feed into this, and indeed some of the key trends in the coming years from a customer perspective. Then we will take a look at a real-world case or a real-world company in the form of Royal Caribbean, a huge player in this industry, and I'll explain in section 3 why we're actually taking this as our real-world case. From there, we're going to move into another real-world case study, but this is focused more on the negative side of the industry. We're looking at the infamous Costa Concordia incident from 2012, and we'll be drawing out some of the lessons and consequences of that really, really important incident. In section 5, then, we're going to tie everything that we have covered in the previous 4 sections together and look at some interesting opportunities and challenges facing companies within this industry. Of course, we cannot identify all of the opportunities and all of the challenges in this vast and very complex industry, but we've picked out what we think are some of the most important ones from the perspective of a company like the one we're dealing with in the pre-scene, and we also include some source material at the end of this presentation for you to peruse at your own leisure should you wish to do so, or should you wish to do a deeper dive on some of the issues that we address in this industry analysis. So before we get into section 1, let me just do some preliminary work here and present you with some of the jargon that you might come across during your studies and indeed on exam day itself. This is just some nautical terminology relevant to cruise and passenger ships, just in case you're not familiar with some of this already. You can see here the back of the ship is referred to as the stern. You have portholes, I should say, down here. These are windows underneath the upper part of the ship. Then you have the air shaft, and this is simply an air vent for releasing air from inside the ship. You have lifeboats then along on the upper deck. You have the stack, which is basically where the exhaust from the engine is emitted. You also then have the navigation equipment here in the radar and light, the masthead light you can see up here top right. The bridge is basically where the people who are navigating the ship and the captain of the ship reside. That's where all of the driving of the ship is done. Then you have the bulwark here towards the front. The hawse hole is simply a hole in the front of the ship through which what's called a hawser can be put. This hawser is used to moor or to dock large ships to a port. So you'll see a huge rope called a hawser being put through the hawse hole in order to dock or port the ship. You also tend to have the anchor towards the front part of the ship, and then the prow is basically the pointy part at the front of the ship. It's sometimes referred to as the bow of the ship as well. So there's just some of the basic terminology to help you navigate your way around these ships, which are absolutely enormous in some cases. So it's good to have a sense of orientation as you proceed through the different parts of the ship where you are relative to other parts. Okay, so let's get into the quantitative market analysis. This is looking at the broadest global and regional trends in terms of growth and projections. We're looking here at the year in review for 2018, and this is a report that was created by the Cruise Lines International Association. This is an industry association, and it really does produce some excellent information. You can find a lot of their information for free online, and much of the quantitative aspect of this industry analysis utilizes some of that information. So you can see here in the center, 2018 global ocean passengers. The vast majority come from North America. Most of North America has the relative majority, I should say, not the absolute majority, it should be said, but the relative majority in this market by far and away. You can see the next in line is Europe at 25.1%. Asia Pacific is growing as well. It's coming up to the 20% mark. And then much less further behind, you have South America and others at 1.7%. So North America is really dominating this industry from a passenger perspective, has done for a long time, and looks like it will continue to do so for the near future. Europe coming in second at 25%. So together they comprise almost 70%, in fact almost 75% of the market amongst those two regions alone. So a really, really huge proportion of the global market coming from those regions. So looking then at overall passengers, overall volume of passengers was 28.5 million in 2018, up to 6.7% from 2017. So we're looking at some really healthy growth numbers here. As you can see on the right, the major growth regions were both South America and North America. It is perhaps surprising that North America has grown so much, considering it's already its absolute share of the market already. It's so high at 49%. To see it grow at 9.4%, this really is a very healthy market market indeed, the North American market. So if we're looking at investment opportunities, North America seems a no-brainer, both in absolute terms and in terms of growth. South America, a promising grower, although in terms of absolute share of the market, it is very far behind at 3.3%. So a lot of room for growth there, you would think, in the coming years. And then here you can see bottom left, the average cruiser is 47 years old and cruises for an average of 7 days. So typically the cycles for cruises are 7 days or 14 days, as you would have seen in the pre-seen document. The average cruiser is 47 years old, so a slightly older demographic we're dealing with here. We're going to come back to the customers and analyse them in more detail in the next section, but worth noting there the average age of the cruiser. But that is, it seems, going to be replaced in large numbers in the coming years by millennials coming on board increasingly. We're going to come back to millennials later on as well. So here we're looking at passenger number growth since 2009. This is just to give you a sense of how healthy the industry has become in recent years. You can see there the growth was quite modest around the 2011, 12 and 13 mark. It has begun to jump then since 2014, 15, 16. The trajectory is looking a little steeper year on year. We're looking at healthier growth numbers in terms of passenger numbers. So you can see in 2019 they're projecting 30 million passengers expected to cruise. So very, very good numbers there indeed. As we saw, United States, North America is the dominant market with the vast majority coming from the United States, 11.9 million passengers in 2018. Then you have China in absolute terms at 2.4%. Germany then 2.4 million, I should say, 2.19 million then from Germany, 1.93 from the United Kingdom and 1.34 from Australia. Deployment, this refers to the main areas or regions where the ships themselves actually sail. This is from a 2017 report by the same association. And as you can see, the Caribbean is well out in front at 35.4%. No surprises there, perhaps, given the fact that North America is the dominant supplier of passengers for this market. And the Caribbean then is geographically relatively close and is easy access for that market. So not surprising that the Caribbean is right up there, 35.4%. The Mediterranean then coming in second for the European market, of course, at 15.8% as the most popular location for these cruises to take place. All other then at 14.6%. And you've got the European market then without the Med at 11.3%. China coming in behind Europe. And then you also have Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific region at 6%. Notice there as well, Alaska at 4.3%. For such a relatively small geographical region, that has a significant portion of the market. And that is related to that adventure cruising segment that was mentioned in the pre-scene. And that indeed is also a growing market. More people are looking for those kinds of adventure cruises. And that market is being well served indeed by some of the major corporations and companies. Looking here at the Asia-Pacific region in particular, the cruise market capacity growth from 2008 to 2016. You can see again, very healthy numbers indeed, and that follows more or less the pattern that we saw in the previous slide for global passengers. You can see around the 2010, 11, 12 mark, things were looking not so great, but since then things have begun to really take off, and that is reflected in the Asia-Pacific region as well as in other regions. We're looking at more and more ships each year and more new ships being contracted. There are currently 272 CLIA member cruise ships projected to be in operation in 2019, and 18 new CLIA member ocean ships are scheduled to debut in 2019. Now, a key question is, how long is it going to actually take to construct one of these ships? As we'll see in subsequent slides, these are absolutely enormous structures, some of these major cruise ships. And it is perhaps surprising to note that actually it doesn't take as long as you might think. Some of these huge cruisers can be built in under 2 years. And when you see the actual structure and complexity involved, that is actually quite surprising. The largest ship currently, the largest cruise and passenger ship currently in the world is the Symphony of the Seas, which belongs to Royal Caribbean. We're going to be looking at them a little bit later on. But as you can see there, that took 30 months, which was the most out of all of the ships listed here. But you can get a sense of the rough ballpark figure for these kinds of ships. It's in and around the 2-year mark, just under 2 years being the average. But Symphony of the Seas is an outlier because of just how enormous it is. We're going to be coming back to the Symphony of the Seas example a little bit later on, looking at it in more detail, just to get a sense of how spectacular some of these structures are. Nice little overview here of the industry. See, these are some of the key quantitative facts about the industry in and around the 2018 mark. In 2017, a record 25.8 million passengers cruised globally. An estimated 27.2 million will cruise globally in 2018. As we saw, that actually ended up being a figure closer to 28.5 million. So you can see that the actual growth is outstripping recent predictions, and that's a very good sign indeed. 126 billion in total economic impact and 1 million jobs paying 41 billion in wages and salaries were generated by the global cruise industry in 2016 alone. Demand for cruising increased 20.5% in the last 5 years. That was from 2017 backwards, and things have continued to increase since then. The cruise industry is the fastest growing category in the leisure travel market, and that is still the case to this day. It really is a very fast growing segment indeed. It is in absolute terms quite a small percentage of the overall tourist market, in and around the 3 to 5% mark, but it is growing very rapidly relative to other segments within the broader leisure travel market. So one to keep an eye on, and a very, very interesting market from the perspective of investment and new entrants. From a capacity standpoint, utilization is consistently over 100%. In other words, these cruise ships are consistently 100% booked for all of the cruises. 8 out of 10 CLIA certified travel agents expect increased cruise sales in 2018. As we saw, that was the case indeed. And it's going to be the same, it seems, in 2019. Throughout its history, the cruise industry has responded to vacation desires of its guests and embraced innovation to develop new destinations, new ship designs, and so on and so forth. We're going to come back to these issues a little bit further on. The cruise ship order book from 2018 to 2025 includes 50 new ocean-going vessels from FCCA and CLIA member cruise lines, representing 220,000 lower berths and an investment value of $51 billion. So now let's look at customers and analyse some of the influencing factors on customer preferences and indeed on demand in general. We're going to start here with an interesting little set of parameters. This was created by Deloitte in their 2018 report, The Next Generation of Cruise Passengers Has Embarked. And they've divided the customer into 5 different areas of concern pertaining to different kinds of needs and preferences and desires. Engage me, this is corresponds to the statement, they engage me in a personalized, authentic and attentive way. So that obviously pertains to customer service dimensions and things like that. Hear me refers to the proposition, they listen to me and my needs, empathize with my situation and follow through. Empower me means they provide me with opportunities and access to drive my experience the way that I want. Delight me corresponds to the proposition that they create moments that surprise me and exceed my expectations. And then know me refers to the idea that they know and remember me, my preferences and my needs. So basically, these are statements that passengers have been surveyed on after they go on cruises and asked whether or not they strongly agree or moderately agree or disagree and so on with these various statements. And based on the feedback from these passengers, then Deloitte has compiled some of the results and some of the insights that they have gleaned from these surveys based on these 5 different dimensions of passenger or customer preference and demand. And as you can see, there's a 70% satisfaction rate with the engagement dimension. There is a 63% satisfaction rate with the hear me dimension, 74% satisfaction with the empowerment dimension, 66% satisfaction with the delight me dimension, and then 67% satisfaction with the know me dimension. Overall, then you have basics, referring to the basics, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on, 75% satisfaction with the basics. So the basics obviously is probably the strongest out of all of the satisfaction dimensions, but these other satisfaction dimensions as well seem to be scoring relatively healthy, up and around the 60 to 70% mark. Let's break this down a little bit more and compare then these dimensions with those from other holiday destinations and holiday types. You can see here cruises compared with hotels and restaurants as separate segments within the tourism industry. And you can see that in particular, the empower me and delight me dimensions are given much more importance in the cruise segment than they are in some of these other segments. You can see empower me is 106 compared to 88 and 57 for hotels and restaurants, and then 84 for delight me compared to 51 and 49 for hotels and restaurants. And this really does speak to the high expectations that customers have brought to bear on the cruising experience. When you think about it, these modern cruise ships sell themselves as an all-encompassing kind of holiday. Everything you could need and want is supposed to be provided on these huge ships. Unlike hotels and restaurants, for example, where the experience is much more specific, it's much more limited, and generally the people who use those kinds of destinations and those kinds of facilities, hotels and restaurants, they will use them in a fleeting manner, much less permanent, much more temporary. They'll go out and they'll see other sights and sounds, whereas the cruise ship is really, for many people, the main attraction of their holiday when it comes to cruise bookings. The ports that they stop at and the excursions that they go on away from the cruise ship itself are kind of secondary considerations, and really the cruise ship itself is the main attraction. For that reason, the expectations are generally much higher when compared to things like hotels and restaurants. So empowerment and delight or thrilling experiences are much higher in terms of importance. Although cruise passengers are more satisfied than restaurant or hotel guests, their expectations then are also higher, as you can see here on the left. These high expectations are further underscored due to the all-encompassing nature of cruises, lodging, food, and activities all combined in one experience. Compared to the restaurant and hotel industries, passengers place additional importance on being empowered and delighted, which are opportunities for cruise operators to create additional value. We'll come back to that again a little bit later on. Coming back to this issue of the basics, and increasingly it is acknowledged within the industry that the basics can no longer simply be basic. Looking at this feedback here, you can see on the left, this pertains to cruise frequency and repeat custom. Improving satisfaction by 1 point for the following propositions: cruise was great value or pleasant spaces to spend time outside of the cabin room. If you have satisfaction pertaining to these two propositions and increase that satisfaction by 1 point for each of those, this in turn increases the probability of a better experience that in turn leads to more frequent travel by 123% in the case of the cruise was perceived to be of great value, and 85% in the case of a perception of pleasant spaces in which to spend time outside of the room. So they're considered very much the kind of basic value propositions and value perceptions for passengers. And you can see how consequential they can be when it comes to frequent or repeat travel on these cruises. You can also see on the right here the influence of the basics and a good perception of the basics on net promotion, or on making these passengers promoters of the cruise ships to peers and friends and so on and so forth. Attributes that increase the likelihood of creating net promoters: the cruise was great value. If the perception is that the cruise was great value, there's a 60% chance of being more likely to be a net promoter. Rooms were well kept, clean and sanitary, 34% increased chance of being a net promoter, and the location of port is convenient and easily accessible, a 30% increased chance of becoming a net promoter. So those really are very basic value propositions there. The cruise was great value, pleasant spaces outside of the room, rooms were well kept and clean, location of port is convenient and easily accessible. So really the basics have to be absolutely nailed, considering just how big these percentages are when it comes to things like becoming a net promoter of the cruise ship and becoming a frequent or repeat traveller. Really, really consequential, very important that the basics are very, very good indeed. And indeed, you might say the basics cannot simply be basic. They've really got to actually impress if you're going to beat the competition and get loyal customers. Coming back to this idea of delighting passengers, and this is taken again from the Deloitte analysis. Delight Me is a satisfaction area, 66%, with broad room for improvement. Even with an ever-growing list of activities and large investments in ship upgrades, 28% of passengers say they're actually unsatisfied with the experiences and activities that they find on board. Since Generation X and Millennials are the groups that value delight the most, enhancing the Delight Me dimension can pay very long-term dividends. With respect to then the empowering dimension, empower me, that is to say opportunities and access to drive my own experience the way that I want. This is really pertaining to personalization, scores the highest in importance and satisfaction for cruises, but there is still room for growth. The use of digital to increase personalization and customization is one very promising avenue to make this happen. Don't let the mention of digital induce too narrow a focus, say Deloitte, on millennials. Older generations show that they also value this category highly as well. So the digital aspect and increasing the amount of digitization on board is not simply something that pertains to millennials and shouldn't only be done with millennials in mind. Other generations show that they value this as well. But this is all linking back to customization, personalization, and thereby giving more power to each passenger to determine the kind of cruise experience that they have. So where to begin in addressing some of these more challenging recent demands, nuanced demands coming from current passengers of cruise ships? Well, the result of Deloitte's passenger survey, the course of technology, and the competitive landscape all point to the same conclusion: to create a differentiated experience in a highly competitive market with increasingly savvy consumers, cruise operators should invest disproportionately in enhancing passenger experience, as well as in the data and digital tools required to deliver self-service and a bespoke in-person experience powered by underlying decisioning and insights capability. So a little bit jargony there towards the end, but I think this really does point towards the importance of data analytics and indeed perhaps big data as the way forward in anticipating consumer desires and preferences and tailoring onboard services as much as possible to those unique consumer tastes.